Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund for the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where those videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. Anyone who knows our speaker today knows that modesty is the first word that comes to mind when you think of him. So I know he will cringe when I tell you this, but his History is Lunch program from May of 2020 on his book, The Civil War Siege of Jackson, is the second highest viewed video in the entire series with almost 10,000 views. So it's a pretty good, yeah. If you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. Faith-affiliated communities in Mississippi, groups who attend churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, house churches, and more, may now visit these museums free of charge in groups of 10 or more, thanks to a grant from the Lilly Endowment. You can stop by the ticket desk, check the museum's website, or call the main number for details, and I hope that y'all will do that. This year, we partnered with the Mississippi Film Office and the Mississippi Humanities Council to launch a monthly movie series. We've added another partner, the Atlanta-based South Arts, which puts together filmmakers with institutions to highlight their works. The slate of 6 South Arts films will be shown this fall and spring. And on Sunday at 2 p.m., we'll screen the first one, the documentary One Pint at a Time. Craft beer generates billions of dollars annually for the U.S. economy, yet despite beer's African heritage, those traditions have been largely forgotten and are rarely found in American brewing culture. Today, black-owned breweries make up less than 1% of the nearly 9,000 breweries in operation. One Pint at a Time examines the black brewers and brand owners who are reshaping the craft beer industry and the future of America's favorite adult beverage. We'll screen the 90-minute film, then have a conversation between the filmmakers and Kelvin Kohlheim, who owns Beale Street Brewing in Memphis. And if we can navigate one final hurdle, we'll have craft beer samples at the event. I hope you'll join us next week for History is Lunch, when Euphus Ruth will examine the history of photography in Mississippi. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back our friend Jim Woodrick, who will present Raiding on the M&O Railroad, Grierson's Winter Campaign, 1864-65. Meridian native Jim Woodrick is the author of the book The Civil War Siege of Jackson, Mississippi. He retired in 2021 as Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer and Director of the Department of Archives and History's Historic Preservation Division. Woodrick earned his BA in Political Science from Millsaps College and is a licensed battlefield guide and volunteer at Vicksburg National Military Park and a member of the Historians of the Western Theater. Help me welcome Jim Woodrick.
Thank you, Chris. It's nice to be back and to see so many, although it's kind of hard to see with this light here, but I know you're out there. Some of my old friends and colleagues, it's so nice to see you, especially Ken Papool sitting out there, and Bill Justice, who's superintendent at Vicksburg. It's so nice to see you here. I hope you enjoy this. This is, if you're familiar with Tim Smith, who someone mentioned a little earlier, he's spoken here several times, and one of his recent books is on the real story of Grierson's Raid, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with Grierson's Raid in the spring of 1863, but that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about another Grierson's Raid. Now let me get the little clicker here, and let's get started. On January 8, 1865, Major General Napoleon J.T. Dana, the federal commander of the Department of Mississippi, wrote glowingly from his headquarters in Memphis that a cavalry expedition sent by him against the Mobile and Ohio Railroad had safely arrived in Vicksburg. After detailing a long list of the expedition's success in the destruction of Confederate property and the capture of hundreds of prisoners, Dana stated that this expedition, in its damaging results to the enemy is second in importance to none during the war. While I personally think he was exaggerating just a little bit, which is neither uncommon nor surprising for commanders to do at that time, and probably still, Dana did have reason to be proud of the accomplishments of the raid, because he had effectively assembled a combat-ready command against long odds to achieve the successes detailed in his report. The long odds, however, wasn't against any Confederate resistance per se, so much it was against departmental commands for cavalry. On December 6, 1864, Henry W. Halleck, transmitting orders from Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, wrote the commanding officer at Memphis that he should immediately endeavor to cut the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, which ran on a north-south axis through the prairie region of North Mississippi. Even in this late stage of the war, Confederates retained effective control of most of that railroad, including the crossroads town of Corinth, which had been reoccupied by the Confederates. The reason for this renewed federal interest in the railroad were events transpiring in Tennessee, where John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee, fresh from being shattered at the fruitless action at Franklin on November 30, now stood before George H. Thomas's reinforced army at Nashville. Halleck's order to Dana arrived the same day that Hood arrived in front of that city's defenses, and by ordering a cavalry raid into North Mississippi to cut the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, which functioned as a supply line for the Confederates, Union authorities were anticipating Hood's imminent defeat from Nashville and subsequent retreat into Mississippi, both of which, of course, did occur. Now, just to be fair, Hood thought he was going into Ohio, but that didn't quite work out. The problem for Dana was where to find the horses and men needed to conduct such a raid. Napoleon Jackson Tecumseh Dana. Try that name on for size. He was no Napoleon. He might have been the other Tecumseh, but he was no Napoleon. Was an 1842 graduate of West Point. He offered his services to the Union Army and became colonel of the 1st Minnesota Infantry. By 1864, he was a major general commanding a department that had effectively been stripped of manpower, but had been given enormous task of disrupting Confederate efforts to supply their troops in other theaters of operations. While ordered to send a raid into Mississippi's prairie region, Dana simply did not have the manpower to do so. His request to keep Edward Winslow's cavalry brigade in Memphis, they were on their way back from Missouri after chasing Sterling Price around for a while, fell on deaf ears because they had been specifically ordered to go to Nashville. He also cast about and found 1,500 men under Embry D. Osmond at Vicksburg, which included the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry, a unit of former slaves from Mississippi, and he sent a message by boat for them to hurry up and come to Memphis. Now, he still hoped to keep Winslow's men in Memphis, and he did what every good bureaucrat does. And I ought to know, because I think I was a good bureaucrat. He stalled for time. That's what he did. And by the time that Osmond's men arrived in Memphis, the crisis had passed. Hood's army had been shattered at Nashville, and Dana had a better argument for keeping Winslow's troopers. Adding these reinforcements to some 1,000 cavalry already in his department under the command of Colonel Joseph Garza, Dana was able to assemble approximately 3,500 men for the expedition. And to command this force, Dana turned to now Brigadier General Benjamin Henry Grierson, his departmental commander. Now, Grierson's name should be immediately familiar to anyone who is the least bit interested in Civil War history, especially here in Mississippi. And I'm not going to go over his career again. other than to say, of course, that he did lead that famous raid in the spring of 1863, which resulted in disrupting the Confederate command and control around Vicksburg and distracting Confederate cavalry units while Grant's army slipped across the Mississippi River on April 30, May 1. Following that raid, Grierson wound up at Port Hudson and then was assigned to more senior commanders in North Mississippi, mostly, except with the Battle of Tupelo, mostly suffered defeats in those armies at the hands of Nathan Bedford Forrest cavalry. Now, after being promoted to brigadier general, Grierson was given another opportunity to exercise complete independent command of an all-cavalry force in what some people have, as already said, some people have termed Grierson's other raid. He would again use his mounted force very effectively. On December 21st, 1864, Grierson's combined force of 3 brigades left Memphis, accompanied by an infantry brigade under the hard-drinking, hard-fighting Brigadier General Michael Kelly Lawler. Lawler's troops were to push east toward Corinth as a feint. Of course, Corinth was situated at the junction of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad and the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, and had been a vital crossroads throughout the war. And as I've already mentioned, it was again occupied by the Confederates. Grierson's successful feint with his infantry toward Corinth allowed his mounted column to move freely into the interior of the state. And after leaving the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, Grierson would be on his own. In his orders to Grierson, Dana specified only that the Union raiders should break the railroad somewhere near Tupelo, and after achieving this objective, he was given wide latitude as to his final destination. In other words, he could go back to Memphis, he could go over to Vicksburg, he could go all the way south to Pensacola or into Alabama and try to release some Union prisoners there. Unencumbered by wagons, infantry, or artillery, Grierson's 3,500 troopers dipped into the Magnolia State on the 21st of December and camped at the small village of Lamar, which is in Benton County. As with the earlier raid, he immediately started casting off patrols and smaller feints to distract the expected Confederate opposition. Well, I think I've gotten ahead of myself. Now, what was the Confederate opposition here in the winter of 1864 and 65? Dana's latest information indicated the presence of at least 11,000 Confederates posted at Corinth, Holly Springs, and Oxford, along with numerous pockets of men guarding the railroad. Had that been the case, of course, Grierson's raid would have been a very risky endeavor because he only had 3,500 men, but that was not the case. Confederate officers could count on a little less than 1,000 men scattered across a truly vast area of the northern half of the state, and many of these were either in unreliable state units or they were unarmed raw recruits. Faced with only a handful of skittish Confederate scouts then, Federal patrols reached the railroad quickly, hitting the M&O. Now we can go to this. Hitting the M&O with twin raiding parties at Boonville and Baldwin, ripping up rails, burning bridges and supplies, and cutting the telegraph lines. By Christmas Day, Grierson's main body approached Tupelo, the first object of his orders. Learning that a Confederate training center, along with heaps of supplies, was situated at Verona, Grierson sent Joseph Kars's brigade, and that's spelled Karge', and I want you to know that I got that pronunciation from Dr. John Marzalek, and since he's of Polish descent, and Karza was Polish, I'm going to trust his pronunciation. I'd been saying Karge', that's not correct. Anyway, Grierson sent Cars's brigade to smash the facility at Verona. Cars's men thundered down the road on a dark and stormy night, had to use that, sorry, and surprised some 300 raw recruits, most of whom managed to flee the Federal onslaught. While not capturing many men, Cars's force bagged an immense amount of supplies, including a 20-car train and 8 warehouses filled with commissary and quartermaster supplies, including 200 wagons, which had been captured by the Confederates at the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads in June. And those were now loaded with supplies destined for Hood's army in Tennessee. By the day after Christmas, Grierson's column was squarely aside the Mobile and Ohio Railroad at Tupelo. Almost as soon as the Union raiders crossed into Mississippi, Confederate authorities knew something significant was in progress. In Jackson, Confederate Major General Franklin Gardner, commanding the District of Mississippi and East Louisiana, started receiving telegraph reports from scouts in North Mississippi indicating the presence of large numbers of Union cavalry and infantry in the region. Gardner was a native of New York and had entered West Point from Iowa, graduating 4 places ahead of Grant in 1843. Like Dana, his opposite in the region, he had been cited for gallantry at Cherigoro during the Mexican War. But with secession, Gardner, who had married into a Louisiana family, the Mouton family, decided to cast his lot with the Confederacy, while his father and his brother remained with the Union, one of many, many examples of a divided family in this period. And another example, like Pemberton, of where the woman that you wind up with decides your fate in the great sectional crisis for some reason. But Gardner commanded a cavalry brigade at Shiloh and served in Polk's Corps for a time, but he's best known for his defense of Port Hudson, Louisiana, which finally surrendered on July 9, 1863, and is sort of the junior twin of Vicksburg. They don't consider themselves the junior twin, but don't tell them they are. Now serving in Mississippi under Richard Taylor's overall command, Gardner faced a difficult task in assembling enough men to prevent the latest in a string of recent federal incursions in his district. Armed with good intelligence on Grierson's numbers, although briefly fooled by Lawler's feint toward Corinth, Gardner started gathering what few forces were available to him. First, he appealed to Mississippi Governor Charles Clark, who was at the temporary capital of Mississippi at Macon. Apparently, Governor Clark was either unwilling or unable to help, as he received no word or assistance from the governor. General Taylor, however, sent a brigade under Lieutenant Colonel William W. Weir, designated the 1st Confederate Veterans, to move by rail north from Mobile toward Corinth. Weir's brigade had been sent earlier to the south to oppose another raid under John Davidson across the southern part of Mississippi in the first 2 weeks of December. And by the way, one of Davidson's regiments was, I believe, the 1st Texas U.S., which was composed almost entirely of native Mexicans. So it's a very interesting raid down there too. Weir's command included a regiment of, or rather, Gardner's command included a regiment of Confederate veterans gathered from various units of the Army of Tennessee, Clark's or King's Missouri Battery, the 1st Regiment of Mississippi Reserves, and John W. O'Neill's regiment, which consisted of about 450 men, the majority of whom were former Union prisoners of war released on the condition that they fight for the Confederacy. All totaled, Weir's brigade, though constituting the ready reserve for the Confederate defense of the railroad, numbered only a few hundred men. Without enough cars to send his entire command at once, Weir left his own regiment for the 2nd train and personally accompanied the remainder to ensure that the Mississippians and the former Union soldiers did not desert at the first opportunity. Reaching Enterprise on December 26, Weir waited for his regiment to arrive and sent the bulk of the brigade north under Colonel Martin Burke of Missouri. Racing northward, and I put that in quotations because trains didn't race too well at that time, these forces were ordered to proceed to Okolona, where it was hoped that the Confederates could make a stand, word having been already reached them that the Federals had broken the railroad at Verona. At West Point, Mississippi, however, an absence of water tanks along the railroad between West Point and Okolona prevented any further movement until enough water could be bailed by the troops. Finally, the train got moving again after 4 hours, reached Egypt Station. Again, the Confederates learned there was insufficient water to make any further headway, so they uncoupled the engine from the cars and sent it on to Okolona so it could get water and take it back to pick up the rest of the troops. Certainly not an ideal situation. On that engine was Major John Hope of Richard Taylor's staff and the engine crew. And when they got to Okolona, they learned that Grierson's column was now at Shannon and that General Golson, who was a commander of state troops, had just 190 men who, according to Golson, had not one round of ammunition. So they were there watching. That's all they could do was watch. So arriving about 4:30 in the morning, Major Hope decided the town could not be held. Okolona, being in a broad open prairie, he wrote, afforded no protection for infantry, and finding it could be approached by 3 roads, I thought it best to not attempt a defense of that place. Hope then ordered the evacuation of Okolona and sent word to Golson to fall back and unite with Burke's men at Matubby Creek, some 2 miles south of Okolona. And I want to note, if you haven't already, that this is my ancestor. Let's see, where did you, okay, I believe that's him. His nickname was Hellfire Jack. I'm not going to go into why, because it's not exactly a good story for my family. Grierson's men, meanwhile, got a late start on December 27, but had no problem brushing aside Golson's scouts at Okolona, occupying the town before noon. Grierson was certainly familiar with Okolona, as he had been part of the disastrous expedition by William Suey Smith the previous February, and they had been roundly defeated by Forrest. This time, however, there was no Nathan Bedford Forrest to deal with. He was with Hood's army in Tennessee, and Grierson set about destroying what was left of Okolona, including a water tank. There's the water tank that the Confederates needed, a railroad turntable, 4 switches, 7 warehouses filled with meat and grain, 3,000 barrels of corn, uniforms, rations, and medical supplies. In addition, they burned most of the town's businesses and at least 1 private residence. Grierson also tapped the telegraph line at Okolona and learned that Confederate reinforcements were being rushed from as far away as Mobile. And he also learned from a Confederate deserter that a force was being assembled at Matubby Creek, which this is Matubby Creek here. It's not a whole lot to it. And Grierson decided to attack at once. Golson, probably a very good decision considering he had no ammunition, however, had already pulled back and retreated to Egypt. When Grierson learned that they had already withdrawn, he camped in force about 4 miles south of Okolona on the West Point Road. And this is not an illustration of the burning of Okolona. There are none that I know of, but I hope it at least gives some idea of what it might look like. And in the winter of December, it might have been, I don't know, I wonder if some of these guys probably got around some of those fires to warm up, because it really was terribly cold. Confederate reinforcements continued to try and move north along the railroad. reaching West Point after a 15-hour train ride from Meridian. Franklin Gardner, who arrived from Jackson, now learned that the Federals had occupied Okolona. By some unaccountable delay, we did not reach West Point until 9 or 10 o'clock at night, Franklin wrote. The superintendent of that portion of the road, he means railroad, informed me that the enemy had burnt Okolona and that trains could go no further. Several citizens stated to me that the enemy were advancing rapidly down the railroad. I proceeded to the telegraph office, and you see the quote up here, I love this, and was followed there by some who were anxious for information and some who had private requests to present. As this interrupted my business, I was compelled to get rid of them by abrupt answers. That's a very nice way of saying that. Gardner telegraphed Major Hope at Egypt that he was sending help and told him that his troops must, quote, stand as long as possible and fight the enemy to the last moment, end quote. That same problem, however, lack of water again caused a delay, as Confederate soldiers were required to stop and draw water from a cistern at Prairie Station, 8 miles south of Egypt, with only 3 buckets on board. That almost seems like a comedy routine if it weren't so serious. That delay was significant because by the time the train again got underway, Grierson's 3,500 troopers were already attacking the Confederates at the village of Egypt. The Union advance on Egypt Station was led by Colonel Joseph Garza's veterans, consisting of the 7th Indiana Cavalry, which had also fought in the Battle of Okolona, the 4th Missouri, 2nd New Jersey, and the 1st Mississippi Mounted Rifles, a unit composed of white Mississippi Unionists, which is a very interesting unit as well. Garza, as I mentioned earlier, was a native of Poland. His father had served as a colonel of cavalry under Napoleon, the real Napoleon, not Napoleon Dana. Joseph Garza was involved in the struggle for Polish independence from Prussia in 1848, and he was condemned to death by Prussian authorities. So he wisely escaped Europe, and he arrived in New York in 1851, and when the war began, he offered his services to the Union and fought at Fredericksburg, later raising the 2nd New Jersey Cavalry. He was considered a talented cavalryman, and after the war, he accepted a position of chair of Continental Languages and Literature at Brother Rogers' alma mater, Princeton University, where he is now buried. Why don't you root for Princeton like you do Alabama? At Egypt Station, Garza called on his old unit to punch through the thin Confederate line and attack what was rumored to be a fortified rail car south of town. This information was leaked by 6 men who had deserted before the battle and informed the Federals that all of the Union prisoners would throw down their arms and refuse to fight at the first opportunity. The main Confederate defense at Egypt, composed of Burke's and Golson's men, were actually quite strong, situated about 1/2 mile north of Egypt and centered on a log railroad blockhouse. The Confederates had posted a strong skirmish line in front, mainly composed of the former Union soldiers, who opened, despite what the deserters said, opened and maintained a heavy fire on their former comrades. And as Garza already expected, the Confederates had placed all of Clark's 4-gun Missouri battery on a flat car south of Egypt. Now, this is not something you see very often in the Civil War. Mobile artillery. And it wasn't that they were being creative, it's that they had no horses to pull the guns, so they improvised. Nonetheless, the prospect of facing mobile artillery greatly concerned the Union cavalry commander, who had no artillery of his own. The 2nd New Jersey thundered down the pike and punched through the center of the Confederate line as ordered, but resistance was fierce from Golson's men and the New Jerseymen. Retreated after suffering a number of casualties on their flanks, and to their surprise, the former Union soldiers continued to pour a heavy fire into the flanks of the 2nd New Jersey. In response, he deployed his whole brigade, leaving the Mississippi Unionists in reserve to hold the pack mules. I guess they didn't quite trust them so much. But with the Confederate artillery now coming into play, Garza searched for help from the next brigade in line, that of Colonel Embry Osmond. And with the arrival of Grierson himself, they initiated a flank movement to get to the armored car. The fighting in front of the blockhouse was fierce. Eventually, it was overwhelmed by Union soldiers, and most of Burke's and Golson's men, including 254 former Union prisoners, were captured. And among these, just as one example, was Corporal M.J. Adams of the 63rd Pennsylvania Infantry, whose regiment had fought almost exclusively in the Eastern Theater, including at the Peach Orchard at Gettysburg. As the armored car chugged southward to escape the Federals, the rest of Weir's Confederates were heading north. Meeting the battery, the men were offloaded and moved at the double quick toward Egypt. They didn't yet know the outcome of the fight at the blockhouse, and these troops dug in south of Egypt and awaited developments. Oh, I did it, Chris. Grierson, seeing the obstinate resistance of the few Confederates that were there, and with growing concern that they were mounting a formidable force to the south, now decided to switch gears and move not to Alabama or Pensacola or to Memphis, but instead abandon the line of the Mobile and Ohio and head for Vicksburg. To reach Vicksburg, Grierson would have to feel his way across rugged and unknown terrain, facing uncertain odds. The Battle of Egypt Station, fought on December 28, had ended with Union casualties of 124. Confederate losses were relatively light, except for the capture of 500 men and the wounding of General Samuel Golson. By the way, I'm not very good at reading handwriting from the war. Folks like Jim and Jeff over here are very good at it. But I have to say, General Golson has some of the worst handwriting I've ever seen in my life. But there may be a good reason, as you'll find out. He was wounded, and he was left, along with 55 other Federal and Confederate wounded, under the care of Confederate surgeon F.H. Evans and Union surgeon John L. Crowder of the 2nd New Jersey. Golson was a resident of Aberdeen, and it would be his last battle. He had already been wounded in the lung, the left leg, and the shoulder in previous engagements, and now his right arm was amputated at Egypt by the Federal surgeon. So maybe he had a reason for his handwriting being so bad. Poor guy. And he was reported to be mortally wounded by both Garza and Grierson, but in fact he survived and he lived another 20 years, dying in Aberdeen at age 76. All of the wounded were subsequently transferred to Columbus, at which time Surgeon Crowder's medicines and surgical instruments were seized for use in the post hospital there. Approximately half of the Confederates captured in Egypt, as I've already mentioned, were former Union soldiers who had been released from Andersonville prison. Grierson, in his report, appealed to the government to treat these men with leniency. Heading west away from Egypt, the Federals camped on the west bank of Holcomb Creek near Houston on the evening of the 28th. Learning that Grierson had now changed course, Gardner telegraphed General William Wirt Adams at Canton and William T. Martin at Panola, which is now Batesville, to watch out for the safety of the Mississippi Central Railroad and to attempt to intercept the raiders. For the next few days, as the Union column headed southwest, the weather grew bitterly cold. To throw off any pursuit, Grierson employed his well-worn tactic of sending patrols in several directions at once, both to gobble up small pockets of Confederates and to mislead his pursuers as to his intentions. Along the way, the cavalrymen burned warehouses, tore up tracks in a number of towns and stations, including Grenada, Winona, and Bankston. At Bankston, the Confederates operated a large textile mill, which had thus far escaped the torch due to its remote location. Employing more than 500 persons, the Bankston Mill was the first successful mechanically powered cotton mill in Mississippi. Described as the model of industrial efficiency and profitability, the mill was owned and operated by Colonel James M. Wesson. In 1847, he and other business partners located the mill on the west side of McCurtain's Creek in Choctaw County. From then until the Civil War, the mill was one of the most profitable in the state, and the war only made it more so. By late 1864, the mill produced 1,000 yards of cloth and 150 pairs of shoes per day for military use. On December 30, a detachment of the 4th Iowa Cavalry, led by Captain Warren Beckwith, surprised the workers and destroyed the entire mill complex, including 5,000 yards of cloth, 10,000 pounds of wool, 125 bales of cotton, 10,000 pounds of flour, and all the horses, pigs, cows, and chickens in the community. So complete was the surprise that Thomas Cogley of the 7th Indiana Cavalry recalled that after the factory had been fired, the superintendent of the works made his appearance in his night attire, and seeing the soldiers sitting around and making no effort to stop the conflagration and taking them to be the operatives, in other words, the workers, he threatened to arrest the night watches and wanted to know why in the hell they made no effort to stop the fire. "Hell and damnation," exclaimed the superintendent in a towering rage. "Would you burn the factory to make a fire to warm by?" Then for the first time, noticed the captain's uniform and that the supposed operatives were armed men. The fact that the Yankees had arrived broke in on his mind, and his utter amazement at making the discovery was as comical to witness as it had been a moment before to see his anger. With the mill destroyed, Colonel Wesson left the area and in 1865 established another profitable mill, which would later be incorporated as Wesson, Mississippi. The mill town of Bankston never recovered from Grierson's raiders and no longer exists except for a small family cemetery. Based on these several raiding parties, which struck installations up and down the Mississippi Central, the Confederates were able to pull together enough information to locate at least one of the Federal columns. And Wirt Adams started funneling troops north from Canton to try and intercept the raiders. Calling up the 11th and 17th Arkansas Mounted Infantry, consolidated, try saying that quickly, from Morton. This was commanded by Colonel John Griffith. Adams focused his efforts on Goodman, a station on the Mississippi Central north of the Big Black River, and of course the site of the town of Goodman today. Already at Goodman was Robert C. Wood's Mississippi Regiment. Another West Point graduate, Wood was born in Minnesota in 1832. He was the son of an Army surgeon who would later become the Assistant Surgeon General of the United States and a brevet brigadier general in the U.S. Army in 1865. Wood's mother was Ann Taylor, the daughter of General Zachary Taylor, so he had good blood. On July 4, his small but hard-hitting command defeated a much larger force at Coleman's Crossroads in southwest Mississippi. But now he had fewer men to spare, and the anticipated clash with Grierson, a portion of which had been reported to be at West, with fresh reports that the enemy was moving southwest toward Lexington and Franklin Church, both in Holmes County. I bet you know those places. Adams ordered Wood to cross the Big Black at Goodman with a squadron and occupy the crossroads at Franklin, hoping to stall the Federal advance. long enough to bring up reinforcements. He ordered up Mormon's battalion from Canton, as well as Gober's Louisiana Mounted Regiment, and Adams arrived by rail to find to his disgust that Mormon's battalion had yet to arrive and that all but 15 men of Gober's regiment had deserted, leaving Wirt Adams with a total of about 330 men. Moving with what little force he had, he advanced boldly toward Franklin. Grierson, during this time, had divided his 3,500 men into three separate columns, one moving north on New Year's Day toward Duck Hill and Grenada to destroy the railroad facilities and other public facilities there, including the Grenada Picket newspaper, by the way. Leading this task force, composed of mostly Iowa troopers, was Colonel John W. Noble, who would later serve as U.S. Secretary of the Interior, 1889 to 1893. A second column, accompanied by Grierson himself, swung to the southwest toward Lexington, with Osborne's brigade headed down the railroad from Winona toward west. It was this column that was sighted by Confederate scouts and reported to Wirt Adams. Not wishing to meet significant resistance further down the railroad, Osborne left the rail line and moved along the Franklin Pike to attempt to rejoin the main column near Benton, which of course is in Yazoo County. As Osborne's brigade, including the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry, approached within a half mile of Franklin Presbyterian Church, Colonel Wood's squad, which had been on it, had advanced to the crossroads, fired on the black cavalrymen, which had been acting as the advance unit of the brigade. Pushing the Confederates back, the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry dismounted and rushed forward to take possession of the church. Hearing the firing, Adams hurried his men down the sunken road, and when he reached the battlefield, he could see that the Confederates and the 3rd USCT had gone back and forth across this battlefield, back and forth across the creek, until such time that the 11th Illinois Infantry arrived to check the Confederate attack. Confederates took shelter behind a rail fence across the creek. They wanted nothing more to do with this force, and Osborne decided to break contact with the enemy, pulling back from the fight at Franklin Church and heading cross-country to Benton to rejoin the main body of Grierson's column. Only after the Federals had departed did Mormon's battalion arrive, too late to lend any assistance. Interestingly, Osborne returned to this area after the war, engaging in the cotton business in Yazoo County until his death from diphtheria on October 4, 1866, at the young age of 34. Some people said he was poisoned. He is buried in Vicksburg and is the highest ranking officer interred at the Vicksburg National Cemetery. The skirmish at Franklin Church on January 2, 1865 was short but bloody, the fighting between black and white troopers fierce. The affair at Franklin Church also represented the last opportunity for the Confederates to intercept Grierson's raid. Failing in that effort, Wood's and Griffith's men moved back to the cover of Ways Bluff Bridge. The raid was effectively now over. Grierson's column quickly moved down the Mechanicsburg corridor to the safety of Vicksburg's defenses on January 3rd, where they found a good supply of rations and forage waiting, courtesy of the post commander, one of my favorite names of the war, Cadwallader C. Washburn. I like that. While it would be a stretch to make the claim, as Dana did, that Grierson's winter raid was second to none in the war, I believe there are a number of lessons that can be drawn from this expedition. First, Benjamin Grierson was a natural cavalry leader if given independent command. Unlike his 1863 raid, he enjoyed numerical superiority throughout the winter raid, but the weather was terrible and maneuvering across the terrain was difficult. He did score many points. I won't go over all these things, but you see it listed here, all the spoils of war. So he gets credit for that. And he should be proud of those. I'm sure he was. But do these constitute a successful raid? Well, consider this. By January 6, just 3 days after Grierson's men arrived in Vicksburg, the Confederates had already repaired the Mobile and Ohio to such an extent that supplies were being moved to Tupelo for what remained of Hood's army. And certainly the number of locomotives and railroad cars could not be replaced at this point. But it's obvious that cavalry alone could not do permanent damage to a rail network. Even during the Meridian campaign, you see that same example. But I think it also sheds some light on the state of affairs in Mississippi late in the war. Not only do we have these unique and interesting units, I mean, former Union soldiers fighting for the Confederacy, cavalry composed of formerly enslaved persons in the 3rd U.S. Colored Cavalry and many other very good units. White Mississippi Unionists, a regiment of native Mexicans fighting in South Mississippi during the same period. Clearly, the face of the Civil War is changing. But it also illustrates, I think, that although many of us probably think that Mississippi was devoid of any resources at this point, that it was, so to speak, an empty shell, it just simply wasn't the case. As you see from all of these things that they listed, Mississippi was still able to produce a goodly haul of provisions for the army, of shoes. These are not good. These have been used, I believe. But the production capacity was still there in Mississippi, was what I'm trying to say. As a postscript, and I'll end it here, the soldiers who fought for the Confederacy that were actually Union prisoners of war faced the charges of treason by their former comrades. And in fact, Union Judge Advocate Addison Hosmer ruled in May 1865 that despite Grierson's plea of leniency in dealing with these men, they should be tried as deserters for having fought the Confederates at Egypt Station. He wrote that the deadly precision of their fire at Egypt shows that they intended to repel our forces if possible, end quote. However, it was General Grenville Dodge who overruled the judge advocate's decision and instead arranged for these men to be transferred to the 5th U.S. and serve out in the western, in the West after the Civil War, which might have been worse than the punishment meted out to them as deserters. I'm not sure. Anyway, I don't agree with Dana that this is the, by the way, I meant to show this slide. I'm sorry about it, but we'll leave that up for a minute for you to look at. This, of course, illustrates that this is a drawing of the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry. And Edward Main, who's the white commander of this unit, that was standard practice, wrote a wonderful memoir that highlights a lot of the activities of this regiment. Very fine regiment. We know that the war is going to end in 4 months when we read about this. But it's obvious to me that even though they could see the handwriting on the wall, both sides fought just as fiercely as they ever did. And these minor raids and events are easy to overlook. But I always think about the fact that we say that they had nominal losses or something like that, and they weren't nominal to the men who were, the families of the men who were killed, or the families for the men who were wounded. And so I think it's always important to look back at what might not be considered the greatest raid in the Civil War, but I definitely think they need to be remembered and studied. So I left a few minutes for questions. Chris, if you have anybody out there, I might have stunned them all into silence. I don't know.
Not the case.
Thank you. Fascinating. I didn't know about this. I have, maybe this is not exactly a question about the subject matter, but I've noticed in every lecture I have attended about battles in the Civil War, the collective noun used for United States troops tends to be Federals, not United States, not, well, I suppose everybody was American, but I mean, every other war we fought in subsequent to the Revolution, we refer to our troops as United States troops. Why do we not do that, even in 2023, when referring to the United States soldiers who put down a treasonous rebellion?
It's because I'm old-fashioned. I will admit it. There are folks who are increasingly using the term United States troops. I grew up, and you see Union troops as much as or more than anything else. And I use Union and Federal back and forth, but it's simply what I'm used to. So, but I know what you're saying, and there are more and more people now using United States troops.
Yes, I was interested where you were showing that Mississippi still was able to provide for the soldiers, the shoes and all. The teenage girl who wrote a memoir of the battle and the siege of Jackson spoke of encountering Confederate soldiers as the Union soldiers were closing in on Jackson during the battle, and that many of them were without shoes. Did we have a lot of soldiers without proper provisioning?
That story comes up a lot, and I know there were people who were without shoes. There's no question about it on both sides. There were Union regiments who were without shoes at times. I think the correct answer is to say that units were often supplied by their states, and if they didn't get a supply in at that particular time, they went without. And shoes wore out, of course. It simply depends on the time that you're talking about. A quick example is that Robert E. Lee's army at Appomattox, we all think of them as being threadbare. There were several carloads of uniforms and shoes and things waiting on them on a rail line not far from Appomattox that they could have easily gotten to if they could have broken through and be reshod, if you will, if you want to say that about people. But it just depends.
You planted the seed. You may not know this, and it may not have happened, but has anybody followed the story of the Union men who were then sent out west? Has anybody told their story? Did they survive, and what was their story, and what was what happened to them?
People have researched it. It's not been published, but there's some stuff out there. I can't say that I've looked into it in depth myself, but there are people that are aware of it at least. I know that at least a few of them deserted from that unit, by the way. So, yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the Mexican and the troops. I wonder how they were treated in comparison to the black soldiers who fought. And afterward, what were their fates?
I have to be honest, I don't know. I don't know much about that unit at all. They were raised in Texas. I would imagine that they certainly weren't treated like other white Union regiments. I mean, I'm making that assumption. I shouldn't say that without knowing, but I feel certain they weren't. But I don't know anything about that unit in particular. But it's something to look into someday. In my next life, perhaps.
any information about how Mr. Wesson got all his heavy factory shoe producing equipment to Bankston?
I don't know. That's a good question. I would assume that it was on the railroad and then by wagon, but it would have taken a lot of doing. But its remote location is what saved it all that time. But I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know that anybody knows. Unless it's Jack Elliott, he probably knows.
If he'd tell
All
you
right.
he did, whether he did or didn't.
Just for everybody's information, some of the personnel records for the 1st Mississippi Mounted Infantry are on hand in this archives.
Oh, great. That's the Union,
That's the Union Regiment.
your Union Regiment of Mississippians, of white Mississippians. All right. Good deal.
Actually, would you say a few more words about the galvanized Union troops and how common that was? Just a little bit more about the.
I don't know a lot about them. I don't know how common it was. It's not that common. I think the only reason I say that is because this story is highlighted as one of the rare examples of the galvanizing of troops. It did happen in a couple of other places that I know of, but not that often. Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for being here. I hope that you will come back next week for History is Lunch. I hope that if you've got time Sunday afternoon, we'll see you for the screening then. We have copies of Jim's excellent book, Civil War Siege of Jackson, for sale over here. Help me thank Jim Woodrick for this program.